Okie dokie. What does federalism mean, by the way?
The federal government has more power.
It means sharing of power between the levels, right? Federal, state, and local working. One of the things that Nixon wanted to do was take away some of the power of the of the federal government and give more responsibility to states. So one of his plans to do this was under the guise of what he called New Federalism. Remember, this is when everybody has a name for something. Starting with the Square Deal with Teddy Roosevelt and the New Deal, and then the New Frontier and the Great Society.
The Square Deal is my favorite. It just sounds so.
Yeah, it does.
Square Deal.
Right, I'm Square Deal Sam.
Yeah.
If any of you become president, please name your legislation. Just from a history teacher perspective, it's way easier to categorize.
Executive Order 1. The Triangle Deal.
Right, Hannah's was going to be called The Mistakes. New. Do what?
The Octagon Deal.
The bow tie strategy. New Federalism was about giving the states more responsibility, and one of the things he did that was through what he called revenue sharing. Revenue sharing was, instead of the federal government handing down money to different organizations or people, he gave money to states in block grants, and he wanted the states to do it. He felt that, and this is very much a conservative principle, that local and state governments are more reactive to the people than the federal government is. It is more bureaucratic in nature. That his argument, and the argument of many conservatives, and it has some pretty solid intellectual basis behind it, is that the larger the government, the more bureaucratic it becomes and the less efficient it becomes. Therefore, if you give money to state and local authorities, they will more efficiently and effectively use those dollars. Nixon was really odd with civil rights. We're going to see some of the things that he said in the Oval Office which were not particularly pro-civil rights. This was also the era of forced busing. What was forced busing? Do you remember talking about that? Duncan?
Where you had to diversify your schools, like desegregate them.
Diversify.
And you would have, like, you would take all of the people in one area, and if you had too much of, like, blacks or whites in one school, you bus them maybe an hour to another school.
Yeah, you were forcing integration, right?
Yeah.
Because one of the problems was, even if we have integration because of Brown versus Board, cities are so segregated, right? There were still black areas of town and white areas of town, and so schools that were local schools ended up being mostly black or mostly white. And as Duncan mentioned, forced busing is trying to move kids around to create some racial integration or, percentiles. Some diversification. He tried to go again. He tried to do away with busing. He lost. The Supreme Court upheld forced busing. Nixon had a really odd historical sort of reality with civil rights. He was definitely a man of his times, we can say. People like Kennedy might have been ahead of his time, and so Johnson when it comes to civil rights. But people like Eisenhower and Nixon, these guys were pretty conservative, and they were men of their time. Today, most national conservatives do not have the same sort of pent-ups because of, a number of realities. That being said, what Nixon did do with race by flipping the South and making it a Republican thing, he used race as a way to get elected by creating the law and order canons. One thing he did was Earl Warren, who you can imagine Nixon did not like, resigned. He retired. So Nixon put in charge of the Supreme Court a new Supreme Court Chief Justice named Warren Burger. Warren Burger became the new Supreme Court Chief Justice. Warren Burger was considered a conservative. And once again, a conservative president puts a conservative man as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, And he ends up not being that conservative. In fact, it's going to be Warren Burger who is going to be the Chief Justice for not only Roe versus Wade, but also finds the death penalty is unconstitutional. So under this particular Chief Justice, they legalize abortion and make the death penalty illegal.
At this rate, they should just start appointing really liberal people and they'll turn out conservative.
I can just see like Nixon like falling asleep at night. He like has nightmares about it.
Well, Nixon, the death penalty one happened in 1971. So in 1971, the death penalty was banned. So until 1979, it was reaffirmed in 1979. Today, each state gets to determine whether or not they have the death penalty. And the federal government does have the death penalty. So if you commit a federal crime, you are eligible. The federal government puts to death far fewer people than states. Texas puts someone to death like every 25 minutes. That being said, the states that have the highest death penalty, the highest amount of death penalty, and actually the states that have the death penalty are the least safe states in the country. And the states that don't have the death penalty tend to be the safest states. And I don't necessarily know if there's if it's about the death penalty or if it's about what people do in those states, but it is pretty odd. The states that are the safest have the least amount of death penalty.
Was it places like Texas?
It's all southern states. Actually, the most dangerous state in the country, we talked about this in here before, right? Louisiana. Tennessee is like second. Texas, it's all southern states. Southern states are, everyone thinks the South is peaceable and happy. We have by far the most violence in the South.
Yeah, you gotta get, eat your beer because someone's going on.
I love that Anderson County showed up on SNL. I will say yesterday I was running and I got scared because I was running in a rural area like on a trail and I heard gunshots. And I was like, oy vey, if I got clipped by someone who's just missing his target, I'm going to be really pissed.
I'm pretty sure that having
We don't go outside during the weekend.
During what?
Like during the weekend of deer
deer
hunting.
season.
Yes. Like we literally don't go outside because we live out. I don't know,
Alright.
like you can't.
Stray bullets.
Yeah. So we don't go walking in the woods, and if we do, my dad seriously makes us wear road vests.
Oh, I absolutely would. Well, when I used to work in the factory, we worked in HR and personnel, and we had what's called a floating holiday. Like you get off Christmas and days and stuff like that. And we had 2 floating holidays, and we started making the first day of deer season, or we talked about making the first day of deer season a floating holiday because no one came to work. I used to have kids, and I bet I have a few here, who still, they go hunting before school, and they come here.
My little brother does.
Really?
I'm not that dedicated.
He doesn't have a deer.
Why would you get up before school?
Mr. Hunter, you guys had Mr. Hunter. His son's my daughter's age, and since the time he was 6, he would take his son, get him up 4 in the morning, and they would go to they would go to a blind or they would go to a stand or whatever, and his son would just sleep. And when a deer would come by, he'd wake up Justin, and Justin would pop up, shoot at the deer, and then go back to sleep.
Dad, when he gets home from work, he takes his work clothes off, gets his hunting clothes on, and goes hunting.
That's culturally interesting. 2 things domestically to move back in the direction of Nixon that you might not think would be particularly conservative is the creation of the EPA and the creation of OSHA. The EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency.
About
So
OSHA
odd.
or the EPA?
The OSHA, what is OSHA?
It's like a
Occupational safety hazards.
Occupational Safety and Health Administration. What OSHA does is make sure that workplaces are safe.
Wait, chemistry?
OSHA stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They keep working places safe. So if you go to a factory, for instance, there has to be fire extinguishers X number of feet between each other. There have to have certain ventilation, right? Coal mines and stuff. They've done work with them to help out with ventilation. When I used to work in the factories when I was in college, there was a job I did, and every day I come and my face was just completely black. My hands were I had gloves on, but even with gloves on, the soot would get through it and stuff. And I would blow my nose and only black would come out. OSHA probably might have wanted to do something about that. We only have it for 6 weeks, so it wasn't a big deal.
What was
We made rotors for cars. One of the things we made, and these rotors got wet in the manufacturing process and they rusted. Well, each rotor cost a couple $100 we sell to Toyota, and so I spent like 5 or 6 weeks, and there were thousands of rusted rotors, and I had to get a power sander and sand it off. And so you're over these things, and this machine's pretty big, so you're sanding it off, and it's just essentially rust that was coming up from the rotor into and I had to wear a mask. Like, I actually had a mask on, and I still had crap going in my nose, and so that's what I had. It would be awful. I would go and I would wash my hands for lunch, but even with my hands washed, I'd take my sandwich and I would look at my sandwich, and there were like finger marks that were all dirt when I would eat. It was pretty awesome.
Delicious.
It was. Now let's talk about why the EPA and OSHA happened. It wasn't just that Nixon thought, yes, I want to protect the environment. This was not one of Nixon's priorities. Why is it that during a relatively conservative administration, 2 very liberal, or at least progressive-minded, bureaucratic government agencies are added to our federal government?
So he was fighting a war. What he was focused on.
Well, what was it? What is the war? What was he focused on?
Foreign policy.
Foreign policy. He was focused on foreign policy. And there was a guy who I talked about a long time ago named Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader was what we call a consumer advocate. He worked tirelessly to try to get the government to pass safety laws. He is sort of at the foundation of pushing and advocating and bothering essentially the federal government until these things were added to our bureaucracy. Ralph Nader was pretty mainstream for a long time. This girl I used to date worked for him. I think he's bought, like in the last 40 years, he's bought like 6 pairs. He's crazy cheap. He's bought like 6 or 7 pair of shoes. He just wears army boots because they don't ever wear out. And he has grown to hate the Republicans and the Democrats equally. He wrote a book. He's written several books. We wrote a book called Crashing the Party that came out in 2000. Many liberals hate him because they blame him for Bush being elected because he took a lot of votes from Gore in 2000. And a lot of liberals were like, in 2008, when he ran, they were like, he wanted to run again in 2008, and people were begging him not to run. They were like, we have a shot, you can stand it. But he was like, one of his big things that he did in this book is he wanted to advocate for, when you go to vote, there to be an option that says none of the above. His problem is he got tired of people